Professor Rachel Rinaldo, Dr. Rika Saraswati, and also Dr. Windy Triana. It's an honor for us to have you all in this seminar this morning. Thank you so much for being in this seminar. And I also would like to thank the Dean of FISIP UIN Jakarta, Professor Alimun Hanif, and the Vice Dean of Academic Affairs, Dr. Bakir Iksan, for their support so we could bring this seminar into reality. And I also would like to thank to all FISIP faculty members and academic staff, especially Bu Mutiara and Pak Alfi, who have supported all the preparation for this seminar. And finally, I would also like to thank all participants for their participation in this seminar. Today, themes of the seminar is gender equality and equitable access to justice for women, and we would like to address the issues of how to ensuring gender equality across the justice system in Indonesia, especially because although we know that there is some effort from the government to ensure gender equality and access to justice for women, we have witnessed some gender gap in reality. And before we start the seminar, I would like to announce to all of the participants that this seminar will be held in bilingual. So feel free for the speaker and also the audience to use either English or Bahasa Indonesia. Nanti juga akan ada interpretasi, jadi bagi peserta yang ingin mengaktifkan semacam live transcript, silahkan diklik di bagian bawah Zoom-nya ada icon atau feature CC, lalu bisa diklik show subtitle atau present all the subtitle. Jadi nanti bisa langsung aktif terjemahannya, bisa langsung dilihat kalau sudah mengaktifkan icon CC, lalu show transkripnya. Oke. Lalu terkait daftar hadir partisipan dan juga nanti ada e-sertifikat untuk seminar ini akan dibagikan di kolom chat di akhir acara seminar ini ya. Jadi setelah sesi diskusi akan kami bagikan link untuk absensi dan juga e-sertifikatnya. And before all the speaker present their research, I would like to invite Professor Alimun Hanif, the Dean of FISIP UIN Jakarta, to deliver his opening remark as well as officially opening this seminar. Prof. Ali, time is yours.
Thank you very much, Prof. Iim, for giving me such opportunity to present some opening remarks, if I may say. And dear speakers, honorable speakers, Rachel, Ibu Rika, and then Mbak Windy, thank you for joining with us for this prestigious seminar. And ladies and gentlemen, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin wa bihi nasta'in wa ala umuri dunya waddin. Assalatu wassalamu ala sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Amma ba'd. I must tell this Rachel and Burika as kind of official statement for those opening the presentations in the morning, because it's like a prize to be got and something like this. Thank you for organizing this conference, Ibu Iim, as part of our academic staff in the in FISIP in Jakarta. The theme that we have chosen for this conference is very important because nowadays almost the discourse on gender equality has been quite declining, and not because the struggle for gender equality come to end, but basically just because there is like a changing situation in which the gender equality discourse coming more into the debate or public debate in the academia and policymakers. 2 decades ago, maybe the discourse on gender quite powerful because of the role of the NGOs or international NGOs in which they engage with the advocacy or research, not really very academic research, but basically how to advocate on the gender equality in social activities or NGO advocacy engagement. So this is important point that I have to address because democracy give us more opening situation in which the institutionalization of gender justice in terms of rule of law, in terms of equality in a role, in social role and public engagement and so on, has been institutionalized into like government regulations or state act. So my impression is that by bringing this discourse into academic debate and FISIP, I'm really grateful to Mbak Iim and speakers that we have here to give some new insight on the way how the gender equality discourse, especially access to justice, is part of our commitment in building equality and justice. So I believe that this is a very important topic. And thanks to those speakers who are ready to present some or sharing some point on these issues, I'm really grateful for that. My impression to have this topic is that more and more the study on gender equality become narrowed into the role of women and the way how this role must be embedded within the state policies or government policies. There is a funny story when our flyers for this 2-day conference has been distributed into the some WhatsApp groups in Indonesia and among the academia, is the fact that for those speakers on gender equality must be dominated by women. And in that picture, I'm the only male speaker to have to give some opening ceremony, opening remarks, and story is that the main story of this message is the fact that why when we talk about general topic we have to provide some women, but when we talk about gender, there is no room for men to talk about the issue. So this is kind of a funny story because it touches into something that I have said, that why in academia, even in academia on policymakers, the discourse and gender equality has been narrowed into the role of women in the public discourse. So I think the problem before is the fact that most of programs, activities, or advocacy engagement on women or gender equality has been dominated by NGOs. So I may say that gender discourse has been NGOized. Everything should be empowerment. Everything should be. So we are really keen on listening to what is new in the gender equality discourses, especially when we relate to the access to justice That's what we have in Indonesia or other third of the developing countries. So thank you for organizing this seminar. I believe that this is a productive engagement for us, for those academia who are engaged with the problem of gender equality. What is important to address here is the fact that during the NGO eras, discourse on women has been addressed, or at least confronted with the cultural challenge, especially the role of women in cultural framework, especially Islam, religion as a whole, and gender, or at least the most of activists of gender equality become a quite contrast or challenging the religious interpretations on gender equality. Fiqhun Nisa, for example, the program that has been initiated by the Nahdlatul Ulama during in 80s and 90s, or gender equality on marriage and the imposition between men and women in family, and mostly interpreted within the cultural framework of gender discourses. But after democracy, it is quite apparent that the challenge is not really very cultural, but also structural. Saya pernah mengikuti satu program tentang di bawah Megel Project pada tahun 2000-an dalam sebuah evaluasi tentang keberhasilan program-program gender yang di bawah Megel, SIDA maksud saya, Canadian International Agency, Development Agency, mereka menganggap bahwa the program of gender in Indonesia is really fail spectacularly. Tapi ketika kita minta contohnya, apakah gagal dalam pengertian kita tidak ada kemajuan, mereka tidak mengatakan yang sepenuhnya begitu, tapi mereka merujuk pada masih adanya undang-undang tentang mengizinkan poligami, masih ada undang-undang tentang pembagian warisan yang tidak begitu adil dalam keluarga berdasarkan dasar-dasar agama dan seterusnya. Nah, dalam disitulah sebenarnya saya mulai mempunyai impression bahwa tantangan-tantangan besar dalam access to justice for gender equality programs is both cultural and structural. Bagaimana membuat undang-undang yang kira-kira bisa mendorong terjadinya keadilan gender, tapi tidak juga menghadapi tantangan kultural yang
access
sangat
to gender,
dalam
access to justice
tradisi
for
Islam,
gender
dalam
equality programs
institusi sosial Islam yang masih ada sekarang ini, kiai, lembaga-lembaga keagamaan, dan juga undang-undang agama, menjadikan kita memang harus terus mendengar hal baru dari para peneliti tentang gender, Rachel, Mbak Windy, dan juga Bu Rika, untuk bisa mengadres isu yang sangat krusial ini. Jadi tantangan-tantangan struktural sudah pasti terjadi, negara dan sebagainya. Tetapi tantangan-tantangan kultural,
bagaimana membuat undang-undang yang kira-kira bisa
menjadikan kita juga
mendorong terjadinya keadilan
lebih
gender,
progresif gitu ya, dalam memberi
tapi tidak juga
menghadapi
apa yang
dalam sebenarnya bisa kita lakukan untuk terus mendorong gender equality ini menjadi
access to
sangat dalam studi khususnya menyangkut Islam, ada aspek-aspek HAM yang
ada sekarang
muncul
ini
dalam
kiai,
diskursus itu memang bervariasi.
keagamaan,
Banyak sekali
dan juga undang-undang
orang
agama menjadikan kita memang
pengadilan
harus
masa
terus
anti kekerasan
mendengar
negara,
hal baru,
lalu kemudian juga anti torture juga bagus. Tapi begitu masuk ke dalam perlindungan hak anak dalam konsep HAM, orang mulai tidak begitu tertarik. Lain lagi ketika masuk dalam masalah HAM yang menyangkut perempuan, masyarakat terpecah. Ada yang begitu semangat untuk memperjuangkan, tapi ada juga yang, well, ini kan agama, ini kan. Nah, dalam konteks semacam itulah sebenarnya tantangan-tantangan kita semakin kompleks untuk menyaksikan di masa depan Indonesia betul-betul berjalan ke arah yang lebih baik menyangkut akses to justice bagi gender equality. Saya kira itu saja. I think that's some point that I have a concern maybe become the thing that all those speakers to address. So I really thank you for coming with us to participate in the conference on gender equality. Thank you very much, Baim. Just go ahead, enjoy talk, enjoy discussions, raise some important questions, and I will come to visit next time with the offline conference. Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Yep. Thank you so much. Yep. Thank you so much, Pak Alimun Hanif. Saya sedikit merespon ya. Ternyata dari tadi guyonan yang di WA itu kita baru sadar bahwa riset itu ternyata very gendered gitu ya. Perempuan kajiannya tentang perempuan, laki-laki kajiannya yang quote-in-quote maskulin. Maka saya mengencourage para laki-laki, akademisi laki-laki juga mengkaji gender, karena dalam proses pencarian speaker kita agak kesulitan gitu, ingin melibatkan laki-laki yang kajiannya tentang isu gender. Dan perempuan juga silakan mengkaji, akademisi perempuan mengkaji isu-isu yang quote-in-quote maskulin, supaya gender balance in academic life is also happening in Indonesia. Okay, terima kasih Pak Ali. And I would like to little bit highlight the aims of this seminar is to discuss legal issues often faced by women and also explore women experiences in dealing with legal issues in Indonesia, particularly in the context of religious or Islamic court, and also examine the extent to which legal, institutional, structural, and socio-economic and cultural factors contribute to more equitable access to justice for women. And finally, this seminar also aims to discuss sustainable justice reform in Indonesia to make sure gender responsive justice environment into reality. Okay, we would like to start with the first speaker, but first I would like to introduce our first speaker first, and also every speaker will have like at least 20 minutes for each presentation, and after that we will have a discussion session. And for the first speaker, there will be Professor Rachel Rinaldo. She is an associate professor of sociology and faculty director of the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. She's interested in gender, globalization, social change, religion, and qualitative method. Her book, Mobilizing Piety, Islam and Feminism in Indonesia, published by Oxford in 2013, has been influential in the study of women activism in Muslim contexts. She has also done research on marriage and divorce in Java in 2022 and 23. She also in 2022 and 2023, she is a Fulbright scholar in Yogyakarta, studying women and work during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. So without any further ado, I will give the opportunity for Rachel to deliver in Muslim context. She has also done research on marriage and divorce in.
Oke, terima kasih banyak sekali kepada panitia dan kepada Pak Ali. Thank you so much for inviting me today to present my research for this seminar. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah, okay, yes. Great. So I really appreciate Pak Ali's comments, especially about how sometimes the discussions about gender equality and women's rights sometimes focus almost exclusively on women's representation in politics. And of course, that's very important. But yes, there are many more issues to discuss. And part of the reason that I became interested in the issue of divorce in Indonesia is that I think, as you all know, Islamic law, Islamic family law, regulates marriage, divorce, and inheritance for Muslims. And that means it's a huge influence on women's status and rights. And I think this has been somewhat neglected as an important arena for determining whether women have rights. Because if you don't have rights in your marriage or your most intimate relationship and your household, then it means you don't really have full rights as a person. So as I'm sure you are all aware, Islamic law tends to, although there are different interpretations, a commonality overall among the different schools is that it stipulates a particular vision of marriage in which the husband is the breadwinner and the family leader, and the wife is the homemaker and the person who is primarily responsible for caring for the children and the domestic sphere. Some other commonalities are that in Islamic law, divorce tends to be easy for men. Men often, in fact, have a unilateral right to divorce for any reason, while women tend to have more limited grounds for divorce.
Java in 2000.
And even if they are divorced, either if they're divorced by their husband or if they choose to try to get a divorce, they're usually much more financially disadvantaged than men. Some other commonalities are that, however, we also know that despite that sort of inequality that's embedded in the law, there have been really major shifts in how marriage and gender are lived in many majority Muslim societies, including Indonesia. Over the past few decades, there's been a large-scale shift to most people choosing their marital partners, and to thinking about marriage in different ways, as thinking about it as a relationship, not simply a way to produce children, but emphasizing love and romance in the relationship. And we've also seen, including in Indonesia, in the past few decades, many more women entering higher education, entering the workforce. And so that means they have more resources as an individual, and especially more access to financial resources. And certainly there have been reforms to the Islamic judiciary in many countries. We've seen in Indonesia, in places like Morocco, Tunisia, Turkey, Egypt, to some extent, a liberalization of divorce laws, more women becoming judges in the Islamic courts, gender sensitivity trainings, and emphasis on making sure that women and the poor have access to the courts. But I think one of the interesting things about Indonesia compared to other majority Muslim countries is that Indonesia's institutionalization of Islamic family law is relatively recent. And it happens sort of at the same time as we see these other changes with regard to marriage and gender that are playing out. So it's this combination that I think really interested me, is the family law on one hand and the changes in marriage and gender. So just to provide a brief bit of context here, but I won't spend too much time on this, but one of the things that also makes Indonesia interesting is that divorce was very high in Indonesia in the first half of the 20th century, and then dropped sharply in the second half of the 20th century, which is the exact opposite of trends in North America and Europe. So it's quite interesting for that reason. Divorce even became stigmatized, especially for the middle class women in particular, by the late 20th century. And we've also seen in Indonesia a trend toward increased state regulation of marriage since the late 20th century, with the marriage law that governs all marriage and divorce in the country in 1974. And then the Kompilasi Hukum Islam, which governs Muslim marriages and divorces, coming out in 1991. So divorce actually then tends to be Muslim women's most likely reason for interacting with the religious court system in Indonesia. The vast majority of cases that are dealt with in the religious courts are divorce cases. And as we'll see, there's been a rise in divorce cases. And the vast majority of divorce cases in Indonesia's Islamic courts are divorces initiated by women. Oops, not sure why I did that. So the question then that I was seeking to ask with my research is, how do Muslim Indonesian women experience and negotiate divorce in the context of Islamic family law? And what can we learn from understanding their experiences? What can we learn about how gender and marriage are changing more generally in Indonesia and other majority Muslim contexts? So as you can see here, there's been a pretty continuous rise in Muslim divorces in Indonesia, except for the pandemic year of 2020, when many people did not have access to courts. And we can also see the difference here between cerai gugat, which is when a woman sues for divorce, versus cerai talak, which is man's unilateral right to divorce under Islamic law. And as you can see, cerai gugat is the vast majority of divorce cases. So just to say a little bit about my analysis of the Kompilasi Hukum Islam in Indonesia. So this is a relatively recent set of guidelines, only adopted in 1991. It's an adaptation of classical Islamic law that's used in the religious judicial system. Similar to other versions of Islamic family law around the world, the husband is designated as the head of household, obligated to support the family. The wife is taking care of the children in the household, and it stipulates that she should obey her husband. So I call this the primary view of marriage, which is embedded in the Kompilasi Hukum Islam. These are gendered roles that are envisioned as different but complementary. However, because the husband is designated as the head of the household and the leader, women's subordination is really embedded in this view of marriage, also via the stipulation that she must be obedient. There is also, you can find what I call the secondary view of marriage, which in some ways is quite different from this primary view, where there is a lot of language in the text of Kompilasi Hukum Islam that also views marriage, that talks about marriage as a physical and spiritual bond based on love, cooperation, and respect, which is similar to what social scientists call a companionate view of marriage. And there's been a lot of social science research about how marriage has changed, mostly drawing on sort of histories of Europe and North America, that in the 19th century, there was a shift from a traditional understanding of marriage, which was really all about producing the next generation, and sometimes about solidifying connections between families, to an understanding of marriage based on the husband and wife being companions for each other. And so this secondary view of marriage kind of is very similar to this kind of companionate view of marriage, but it's a little bit, I think, somewhat at odds with this primary view of marriage that's much more strongly gendered and embeds women's subordination. Now, in some ways, Compilasi Hukum Islam is probably the most liberal of Muslim family laws around the world because it gives women very broad grounds for divorce in Indonesia, much broader than in most other majority Muslim countries. Men still have the unilateral right to divorce, cerai talak, but they must go through the court. And women tend to get pretty much automatic custody of children under 12 unless they can be ruled nusyus or disobedient, which these days tends to be rarely applied, but is still in the law. Now, an important thing to recognize about the Compilasi Hukum Islam is that with cerai talak, the husband must provide some financial restitution to his ex-wife, both during the process and afterwards. So somewhat similar to child support, for example, in the US or Europe. However, with cerai gugat, women are only entitled to what I consider to be very minor forms of financial restitution, mostly just during the divorce process itself. So in that way, they're very much financially disadvantaged, and there's a real inequality between men and women in that sense. So I argue that the Compilasi Hukum Islam can be understood as a state Islamic vision of marriage because these are guidelines that came from this state. And it embeds a gendered division of labor in the marriage in which women are subordinate to men. So I just wanted to talk today about some of the findings from my recent study. This was part of a larger collaborative study conducted with Ibu Itfa Nisa and Ibu Nina Numila, and involved in-depth interviews with divorced women as well as divorced men, and interviews with judges and court observations. So mostly I'll just be drawing on the interviews that I did, which were in the Malang and Yogyakarta areas. So one of the themes that came out of the interviews was that women had felt that certain kinds of behavior in marriage were just unacceptable. And so I call these the deal breakers. These were the things that caused them to want a divorce. And these tended to be infidelity or their husband being unfaithful to them, violence or abuse, either physical or emotional, frequent conflict in the relationship, or lack of responsibility on the husband's part. This was sometimes financial responsibility, but actually it was often emotional responsibility as well. And what was interesting about their narratives is they tended to emphasize the need for love and communication and mutuality in their marriage. And these were the things that they felt like they weren't getting from the marriage. And so, reading through their narratives, it was really about, these are the things that are going on in my marriage. My husband's being unfaithful, or he's being abusive, or he's never home. And that's not how a marriage should be. This was often the way women talked about it. So in that sense, their narratives really echoed that secondary companionate vision of marriage that can be found in the Compilasi Hukum Islam. But women tended not to challenge the primary view of marriage, at least not directly. So they didn't say to me that they disagreed with the husband supposed to be the breadwinner and their role as being more domestic. But in subtle ways, they suggested criticism of this. So for example, quite a few women told me that they weren't that interested in remarrying. And from that, I could tell, and some of them would say, yeah, this is the way marriage is. I have to serve my husband, so I'd just rather not get married again. So in that sense, I think a lot of women, even though they're not necessarily expressing direct opposition to that model, it's clearly something that they are not satisfied with. They were also tended to be very aware of what are grounds for divorce for women in the Compilasi Hukum Islam. And so they knew that infidelity, that lack of financial support, that behavior such as gambling or drug use could all be considered grounds for divorce. But they tended to most emphasize the lack of financial support. And this, I think, was really because they knew that this is something that elicits almost automatic support from the judges in the Islamic court. And so in reality, while I think for a lot of them, their biggest concern was the lack of emotional support, because they knew that the lack of financial support was the thing that would get the judges' attention. They tended to emphasize that most. So in this sense, there is an interesting paradox here. There is this, the gendered primary view of marriage in the Compilasi Hukum Islam certainly upholds a very essentialist understanding of gender roles, right? With the man being the breadwinner. And yet it gives women a way to hold their husbands accountable, right? And this is something that they can sort of seize on as an easy way to exit the marriage. Another theme that came up that I found to be very interesting was that many women felt that they were able to leave their marriages because they could support themselves. And this was certainly, some of this was because I did talk to a lot of women who had a university education. And so they were aware that even if they had not been working during their marriage, that they could go back and get a job that would pay reasonably well, because there simply aren't that many university graduates still in Indonesia. And so, the jobs that they can get are pretty decent. Many of them also had support from their families, from their friends, even sometimes from work colleagues. And this was often very helpful for them as well. But I found that this was also true. I heard these narratives from lower class women, who sometimes only had education through SMP, or maybe, had not finished high school or SMA. They talked about pride in being financially independent. And in many cases, they would say that they were prepared to be single parents. They, in fact, preferred to be single parents rather than in a bad marriage. So even though there were financial disadvantages, women were aware of that and tended to want the divorce so much that they weren't dissuaded by that. But there were certainly a lot of challenges and difficulties that women faced. Whether they were a case of cerai gugat or cerai talak, most women reported that they did not receive the financial restitution to which they were legally entitled. And the courts do have mechanisms to enforce this. And what I found is that in some cases, women were not aware of that. And so they wouldn't receive the money, and they didn't know what to do, and they just, kind of went on with their lives. But in a lot of cases, women also didn't want to use that mechanism. They were worried that if they reported to the court that they didn't receive the money that their husband was supposed to be paying, that somehow they would have to sort of be more in contact with their husband. And they didn't like that idea. And some of them just wanted to be completely done with their relationship and didn't want to have any contact with him again. And others they didn't want to bother. They felt that, especially often in the case of cerai gugat, sometimes they felt that it wasn't enough money to bother with, actually. And so they just let it go. Not surprisingly, then many women did face financial difficulties during the divorce, or especially in the first year or two afterwards. That tended to be the most challenging time. And many women needed the assistance from their family members. So quite a few women, it was very common for them to move back in with their parents, for example. The other challenge that I found is that particularly for women who were more middle class or above, the divorce cases tended to be more complicated because there were disputes over property and assets. And here things tended to be mixed. Some women felt that these things got divided up in a fair way, but several women also told me about their experiences, which felt to them very unfair and unjust. One woman, for example, she was embroiled in a very long case with her ex-husband, where when they had bought a house, his family insisted on the title being in his name, which makes it, considered to be his property rather than joint property in the divorce process. But she had been the one, she said, who was doing the payments every month. And she actually had receipts, from her bank showing that she was making the payments on the house because a lot of the time he wasn't even employed. So she felt that she, the house was really hers because she had actually paid for it. But unfortunately, the judges in her case did not consider that to be the case. They looked at the name on the title. And so they ruled that the house had to be sold and they would split the proceeds from it. And so she felt that this was unjust, given that she had paid for all of the house, but was only getting half the money. And I should say this is a common issue. I think worldwide we see these kinds of issues. It's not limited to Islamic courts at all. These are issues that are certainly very present in the U.S. Family court system as well. So the judges, I think, tended to be fairly sympathetic to women. I was actually surprised at how sympathetic they were to women. They tended to sort of have expressed both the primary view of marriage and the secondary view of marriage. So they would talk about marriage as a partnership, but they would also emphasize the gendered responsibilities of spouses. And so they didn't seem to see this as a contradiction. They did tend to be very critical of husbands' behavior. They often told me that, when there was physical or emotional abuse in a marriage, that marriage was really broken, and they were sympathetic with women for wanting to be out of that marriage. And they tended to, although there is a required mediation process in the beginning of the case, the judges told me that it rarely works. And that they really tended to see their role as just helping to resolve the divorce as amicably as possible. So just another quick anecdote from the court. There was a case of Charai Talak where a husband wanted to divorce his wife. They had 4 young children and she was not working, so she had no source of income of her own. And so when the judges heard this, they were actually, you could see the dismay on their faces when they heard this. The lead judge was a woman. And so they ruled that he owed her a pretty substantial amount of money in order to be able to care for the children, to be able to make sure that they could still live in the house, which they weren't finished paying for. And so the husband then complained about this, and he said, this will bankrupt me. And the judge, the woman judge, kind of just snapped back at him. Well, that's how it is if you want to get a divorce. So clearly, I think, I saw things like this fairly often in my court observations where judges seemed somewhat impatient with men who were divorcing their wives. And the men don't have to give a reason for it, whereas the women do. So another sort of inequality that suggested to me that some of the judges were perhaps frustrated with that dynamic. So overall, in my study, many women found it relatively easy and quick to obtain the divorce, but their experiences were not always positive. They, had difficulties with receiving the financial support that they were owed. They faced financial disadvantages and so on. Women were quite knowledgeable about their rights and obligations in marriage. I found in particular, their friends and social networks played a large role in this, and that, they often had a friend or family member who had gone through a divorce and gave them advice. Overall, the women did not challenge this primary vision of gender embedded in the law. At least they did not challenge it in a direct or explicit way. But they did very much express aspirations for a marriage that would be founded on mutual respect, love, and companionship. So I argue that there is actually a shift in marriage ideals among women that is happening. And women are more able to act on these ideals than previous generations because they're more likely to be educated. There are more opportunities in the workforce for women. And so they're somewhat more financially independent than their mothers or grandmothers would have been. So I think what's sort of a fascinating paradox here, at least from the perspective of social science, is that the Kompilasi Hukum Islam gives women a means to exit marriage. And it's precisely through this emphasis on husbands' obligations, which is very gendered, but also gives women a way to hold their husbands accountable. So on the one hand, we can say that the Islamic judiciary in Indonesia does work to reinforce traditional gender expectations. But on the other hand, it facilitates women's exit from marriage. And so this may have long-term unintended consequences of accommodating women's rising aspirations for more fulfilling marriages, and giving them, a way to exit unfulfilling marriages, which in the long run may mean that women become more independent of marriage, and may sort of lead to much broader social change around what a marriage should look like and what relationships between men and women should be like in society. And certainly women having more rights in their marriage and divorce would, I think, contribute to gender equality overall. So I will stop there and I look forward to your questions.
Iya, terima kasih banyak Rachel atas presentasi dan risetnya. Mungkin sedikit menyarikan ya, risetnya Rachel ini lebih mengeksplorasi tentang pengalaman-pengalaman perempuan dalam kaitannya dengan perceraian gitu ya, dan juga kaitannya dengan kompilasi hukum Islam. Terlihat dari temuan Rachel di sini bahwa pengalaman yang dialami perempuan itu bisa berbeda-beda ya, bahkan tadi disinggung antar kelas sosial pun bisa ada perbedaan tapi juga kesamaan. Misalnya tadi yang terkait pride gitu ya, kalau meskipun biasanya orang yang berpendidikan tinggi dia cenderung independen sehingga mereka lebih berani untuk mengajukan perceraian, tapi ternyata ada juga di kalangan yang kelas bawah atau yang dari tingkat pendidikan yang rendah tetap memilih untuk bercerai dengan alasan pride gitu, daripada hidup dalam pernikahan yang tidak bahagia, lebih memilih bercerai. Lalu Rachel juga tadi meng-highlight peran KHI ya, kompilasi hukum Islam di Indonesia, bahwa di satu sisi KHI ini cukup liberal ya, bahkan dalam konteks muslim, negara-negara muslim, jadi satu poin positif dalam konteks Indonesia. Tapi di satu sisi KHI ini juga sebenarnya tetap mensustain, memaintain gender relasi yang tidak equal atau maintain traditional gender relation gitu ya. Meskipun tadi satu sisi lagi-lagi kompilasi hukum Islam ini juga memberi tools atau menjadi sebuah tools atau mekanisme yang bisa mengempower perempuan untuk tadi kalau mereka merasa pernikahannya tidak bahagia, kondisi gender unequalnya dirasakan dalam kehidupan pernikahan mereka, mereka bisa menggunakan itu gitu untuk mendorong mendorong laki-laki accountable gitu ya, mempertanggungjawabkan kewajibannya yang sudah dicatatkan juga dalam kompilasi hukum Islam. Mungkin itu kurang lebih ringkasan singkatnya, Rachel. Semoga menggambarkan presentasinya. Meskipun ada banyak hal yang tadi sudah di-cover Rachel, nanti mungkin partisipan kalau ada pertanyaan akan ditanyakan langsung di sesi diskusi. Selanjutnya saya akan berpindah kepada presenter yang kedua yang akan fokus pada tema Indonesian Women Access to Justice when dealing with domestic violence. Jadi spesifik ke kasus domestic violence. Kita sudah ada Dr. Rika. Okay, I will introduce her first. Dr. Rika finished her undergrad and master degree in the Faculty of Law, the University of Gajah Mada, and she obtained her PhD from the University of South Wales, Australia in 2014. Her research interests include gender and law, domestic violence, and the right of the child. And now she is the head of the School of Law, Faculty of Law and Communication, Sugija Pranata. Benar nggak, Bu?
Ya.
Sugija Pranata Catholic University Semarang ya, Bu ya?
Ya.
Oke, ya. Tanpa berpanjang kata, silakan Ibu Rika, time is yours.
Can everyone see my PPT?
Ya.
Okay.
Mungkin perlu di full screen, Bu.
Oh, full screen. Okay. Okay.
Yep, sudah.
Okay, thank you very much. This is my curriculum vitae. Okay. Okay, I would like to tell about a little bit about my research, which was conducted in 2014. And then it's about the domestic violence. Okay, as an introduction, domestic violence has been an important issue generally among feminists since the 1970s. And then it became an increasing concern of the Indonesian women's movement in 1990s due to the rising numbers of domestic violence cases. And then in 2004, the Indonesian government issued Act number 23 of 2004 on the elimination of domestic violence. So what happens, or what the content of Domestic Violence Act? The Domestic Violence Act it aims to eliminate all forms of domestic violence, to protect the victims of domestic violence, to take action against the perpetrators of domestic violence, and preserve the unity of harmonies and their prosperity. Domestic Violence Act defines such violence very broadly to include any physical, psychological, or sexual abuse, including the threat of committing such abuse, a failure to provide for the household, or prohibiting women from engaging in paid work. It also provides fines and imprisonment for up to 15 years. The scope of a household includes husband, wife, children, and domestic servants, and anyone of a blood, marital, or adoptive relationship living in a single residence. The Domestic Violence Act also regulates the rights of the victim of domestic violence. In Article 10, the rights includes protection of the family, police, prosecutors, courts, advocates, social institution, or any other party, either temporarily or based on the determination of court protection order. The second one, health services in accordance with medical needs. The third one, special handling related to the victim confidentiality. The fourth one, assistance from a social worker and legal assistant at every level of the examination process in accordance with the provision of legislation. And then the right for get a spiritual guidance services. And then the act not only gives the responsibility to government to prevent and stop domestic violence, but also involve the role of community. So the community can actively report the domestic violence surround their community. So they can report if they hear or if they see the domestic violence. Domestic violence issued in 2004, and my research was conducted in 2014, and then now is 2022. So how the development or how the situation and condition after domestic violence acts issued in 2004. There is a figure. I took it from Women Empowerment and Child Protection Ministry System Information in 2022. In the left figure, there is the number of cases by sin. Most of violence happens or occurred in a household. And then the number of victims by sin in the right slide, in the right figure. The number of victims by sin mostly are in household with black color. And black color, it shows that victims by skin in household are the highest. And then other skin is in workplace, and then other in school. And then the other figures is about perpetrators. Perpetrators based on gender and relationship. Most of the perpetrators are male. Okay? And then the relationship between perpetrators and victims. The orange ones is husband or wife. And then the yellow one is boyfriend or girlfriend or friend. So based on these figures, we can find that perpetrators based on relationship mostly done by husband or wife. Okay, so after we know about the domestic violence, after we know about the statistics of the domestic violence, so how far the women of domestic women who experience of domestic violence can access justice. Yeah. But we have to know what is justice first. Donna Cocker defines justice as can only prevail in a society free of domination and violence against women. This concept includes holding the abuser accountable, affording all parties due process, ensuring that the survivors' claims are heard, treating people fairly and respectfully, and guaranteeing equal access. This is the definition of justice according to Cocker. But in fact, the ability to access resources, to access justice is need to access resources, because access resources is the way that the victim of domestic violence can access justice more easier. Access to justice may be defined most narrowly as access to the courts or legal proceedings. And the law is supposed to be applied equally in all situations and to all persons, regardless of their identities. So based on the Cocker definition on justice, justice requires equality of treatment in accordance with the classification laid down by the rules. So there's need a special arrangement in favor of the poor or the vulnerable of the community, including women, who are needed to enable them to seek justice on an equal footing with those who possess natural, social, or economic advantages. This is this figure has demonstrated how far women who experience domestic violence can access justice. The left figure I took from my research in 2014, and then the right one I took the data from Komnas Perempuan, catatan tahunan kekerasan terhadap perempuan in 2021 from Komnas Perempuan in your report in 2021. So from the research in 2014, women victims of domestic violence had found difficulties to report their domestic violence, because of the police behavior. If I compare to the situation in 2021, based on the annual report from National Women Commission in Indonesia, in the line 3, apparatus perspective. So apparatus perspective still become the obstacles for women to get or to seek justice. So the apparatus perspective become the obstacle to implement Domestic Violence Act. For example, maybe I can read it. The experience of respondent ME, she thought that police officer asked her to reconcile with her husband. And then police officer, another respondent, police officer asked her to seek witness to support her psychological violence report. and then police officer asked her to report her case to another police station. So this case has demonstrated that unprepared police officer when woman report her case to the police. And then police officer was reluctant to process her reports, which had been withdrawn. So there's a pattern of report and withdrawn, or with report and cancel. That is also the factor that make the police reluctant to process the reports. And then officers accuse her of falsifying marriage document. So it's sometimes happen that the husband falsifying the marriage document by admitted that he is not married. He is not married man, but still single. Yeah. But in this case, the woman become the person being accused of falsifying marriage document. And then police officer was reluctant to process her report because of her husband's age. Okay. And then in the same case, other officers asked her for a sum of money to process her report about her husband. And then police officer asked other respondents her to think deeply because of the presence of her children before her husband was taken away. And so the respondents reconsidered her complaint. Other respondents said that police officer advised her to seek witnesses for psychological violence and neglect. After report, there was no progress after 2 years. This respondent's experience in 2014, and I think this still happens in 2021. Because based on this figure, the second line, there is a report that victims withdraw the report, and these actions become an obstacle to implement domestic violence. And then the fourth line, lack of evidence. Yeah, lack of evidence. Lack of evidence, for example, especially for psychological violence report or for sexual violence report, and also neglect. Yeah. If for physical violence, usually it's easier to get the evidence. And then the fifth line, unregistered married. Yeah, unregistered married. It's also become the obstacle to implement domestic violence. Unregistered married, in my opinion, it should not be an obstacle for apparatus to process the report, because domestic violence act has, because the domestic violence act defines household broadly, yeah, including all the people who live in the same household. Okay, and then we look at the other figures. to justify that women who experience domestic violence or women's victim of domestic violence still have found difficulties to access justice. This is court verdicts on domestic violence cases. For example, if the violence causes injury or pain, average the minimum prison length in years, a year, and maximum 13 years. But average prisons, it's only a year. And then criminal acts result in serious injuries. Minimum prison length 2 years, maximum 4 years, but average prison only 1.5 years. And then result in death, minimum prison length 6, maximum 13, average prisons only 8.8 years. Based on 3 examples, we can see that the implementation of the Act in providing punishment for perpetrators may be more lenient than the legislation was intended to be. Judges imposed lenient penalties on the perpetrators based on reasons such as incidents being a family matter, and the perpetrators the breadwinners, resulting in his family members suffering all the more due to a lack of family income. Okay, so women who experience domestic violence usually to cope the violence on 2 ways: bring the case to public legal system, or to report, that is to report the violence to police, or to divorce. Prof. Rachel already explained a lot about divorce, but let me explain a little bit divorce in dealing with domestic violence. Okay. Another way to cope domestic violence for women who experience this violence is divorce. They can take position as litigants or non-litigants, or plaintiff or non-plaintiff. As Professor Rachel mentioned, that successful women litigants in religious courts sometimes only have minor financial results. Yeah. Sometimes they have no rights to ask for a living to be provided by their former husband after the divorce. But since 2018, they can file a claim for Madhya living, Idah, Mut'ah, and children's living, as long as they are not nusyus. So to identify whether a woman nusyus or not, it depends on the judge. Yeah. Women who escape for domestic violence by applying for divorce still face some difficulties, yeah, because they have to struggle to take or to get child custody, sometimes child neglect by ex-husband. They also have found difficulties enjoying properties until how to struggle becoming a single parent or becoming a widow. However, divorce does not guarantee the victim is free from violence by her ex-husband. Because based on the data from Indonesian National Women Commission in 2021, violence against women still occur, which was conducted by or committed by her ex-husband. Okay, this is some of Indonesian government policy to support women who conflict with law, such as Supreme Court regulation, Perman number 3 of 2017, on guidelines for adjudicating women's cases facing the law. And then based on this Supreme Court, the religious court issues Supreme Court circular letter number 3 of 2018.3 on the results on the plenary session of the religious chambers states that the wife in divorce case can be given madiyah, living idah mutah, and child support as long as it's not misused. Okay, and then the data from the government. In 2021, there will be approximately 400,000 divorce cases in the religious courts and the Sharia courts, but only 70% of the cases were filed by women as litigants. However, only 3% of divorce verdicts take aside to women's and child's rights. And then only 0.26% of the 3% have applied for execution. So this is the situation and condition for women who applied for divorce. So the question is, what happens? Yeah, what's wrong? Is the women's wrong? Women's is the fault of the women or what? In order to understand about the way of women to cope domestic violence, we have to understand that there is relations between power, law, and space that influence the women to cope domestic violence. This is very theoretically, but I think it's important to all the community to understand the relationship about power. The relationship among power, law, and space. Okay. Power, what is power? Power is the ability to make others conform to one's wishes or a set of strategies employed to accomplish one's goal. Meanwhile, law is defined as a set of rules consisting of legislation, institution, and apparatus that those in power lay down and enforce. So the law is a representation of power. It's always established and interpreted within certain social contexts. Power and law can work can work only if they has a space. What is space? Space is developed through a unitary of space. Yeah, it consists element of physical space, mental space, and also social space. And the three forms of space combine together to produce a complex spatiality. This complex spatiality include the power and love. The relations among power, law, space, and women will influence if women cannot access this power, law within space. So power, law become oppressive to women. But if women can access power, law, or can use the power of law, so this relation can empower the women. The argument for this for this issue, because I use the Michel Foucault argumentation that law is a representation of power and a form of knowledge, which has new paradigm as a disciplinary power. So law is not only an oppressive system, but it's also give knowledge for everyone. Law is not only described to institution or institutional forces anymore, but by the myriad local and particular interaction which constitutes society. So, if women have this power as a knowledge, so she can use the law as institutional, the law as no legislation, as her way to cope the domestic violence. But it's not an easy way to women to cope the domestic violence based on this theory, because the law, power, and space, it occurs in every community. To understanding domestic violence and to understanding domestic violence and the way of women to cope the domestic violence, it can be searched through ecological approach. Ecological approach is adapted from the Laurie L. Hayes in her journal Violence Against Women, an integrated ecological framework. There's layers in ecological approach. The first one is about personal history. Personal history is the basis of individual experience. It's about history of the violence. It's history about the women's experience. It's the way the woman cope the violence, whether she will stay or leave the violence, or how come take she can break the silence. Yeah? If from the personal history, if they have decided to leave or break the silence, so she can approach the other layers. The other layers in the microsystem. The microsystem, microsystem, is the primary context in which the abuse takes place.
Ibu
in the
maaf
family.
nge-cut 2 menit lagi ya Bu.
Okay, yes. And then the ecosystem, it represents the institution and social structures, both formal and informal, such as the world of work, neighborhood, social network, identity group, and etc. And then macrosystem, it represents the general view and attitudes that permeate the cultures, values, and beliefs at large, such as patriarchy, which would influence the organization of power in community and distribution of decision making. And then the last layers, it represents the interplay between various aspects of person's social environment. It comprises the linkage between an individual and other social institutions and networks, such as between the abuser, family, friends, police, court, and social services, and etc. So the way of domestic violence to cope domestic violence or to escape from domestic violence is very complicated because these layers already demonstrated about the obstacles that women must have faced. Okay, the conclusion that the experience of Indonesian women's victims of domestic violence have shown that they have often had opportunity to access many resources to seek justice. For example, to report the police and then to go to the religious court, to divorce, and then, however, it must be acknowledged that not all resources were helpful and useful in individual cases. Depends on how far she can afford, or she can access knowledge, she can access the law within the species. And then power is not simply to be seen as constraining force, but is also facilitative. And then every layers and ecological approach consists of the relation of law, power, and space that must be considered and used strategically to empower women and to eliminate domestic violence. Okay, thank you very much. This is the reference, and then thank you.
Thank you so much, Bu Rika, atas presentasinya. Mungkin saya sedikit sedikit memberi ringkasan mungkin ya dalam bahasa Indonesia. Kurang lebih mungkin risetnya Bu Rika ini ingin melihat bagaimana sih akses perempuan terhadap justice atau keadilan dalam konteks domestic violence gitu ya, setelah Undang-Undang 2004 tentang Domestic Violence Act dan dampaknya sekarang atau risetnya Bu Rika waktu itu 2014, apakah ada perubahan? Dan tadi disodorkan data ternyata angka kekerasan dalam domestic violence itu masih tinggi, dan tadi angkanya yang terjadi di rumah tangga, pelakunya itu tadi laki-laki, hubungannya itu suami atau istri ya, yang dominan dari semua kasus-kasus yang terjadi di tahun 2021 dari data yang ditampilkan tadi. Dan juga tadi Bu Rika juga meng-highlight beberapa kendala yang membuat perempuan susah mengakses justice gitu ya ketika mengalami kasus domestic violence, dan terlihat dari data yang dikumpulkan Bu Rika tahun 2014 dengan data dari Komnas Perempuan ya kalau nggak salah tahun 2021, ternyata kurang lebih trennya masih sama, challenges-nya gitu ya. Pertama misalnya tadi perspektif aparatus ya, kepolisian yang cenderung, mungkin saya quote in quote victim blaming ya Bu ya, lebih kecenderungnya udah cabut aja, datanya tidak lengkap dan sebagainya. Akhirnya tadi kendala lainnya adalah tingginya pencabutan laporan terhadap kasus kekerasan rumah tangga gitu ya. Lalu juga tadi status perkawinan yang tidak jelas dan juga kurangnya alat bukti itu beberapa kendala yang sampai saat ini dari studinya Bu Rika yang tahun 2014 ditemukan juga masih ditemukan di tahun-tahun ini gitu ya. Lalu juga Bu Rika tadi meng-highlight apa sih yang menyebabkan kemudian masih terganjalnya akses perempuan terhadap justice terutama terkait dengan kekerasan domestik itu. Bu Rika meng-highlight ada 3 komponen penting antara power, law, sama space. Yang ketiganya itu punya hubungan interaksi yang sangat penting, dan Bu Rika juga meng-highlight bahwa power itu satu sisi ketika perempuan punya mampu menggunakan powernya dalam kaitannya dengan hukum, maka bisa terjadi empowerment terhadap perempuan. Tapi sebaliknya kalau perempuan tidak memiliki power untuk menggunakan hukum, maka yang terjadi justru hukum itu menjadi atau power itu menjadi opresif terhadap perempuan ya dalam kasus domestic violence yang terjadi seperti itu. Mungkin itu kurang lebih ringkasan singkatnya yang sudah disampaikan oleh Bu Rika. Nanti selebihnya kalau ada yang masih ingin ditanyakan terkait risetnya Bu Rika bisa akan langsung ditanyakan pada sesi diskusi. Nah sekarang kita akan akan pindah ke presentasi yang ketiga yang akan fokus pada bagaimana reformasi pendidikan hakim. Jadi kita mau melihat gender and Judge Educational Reform yang akan disampaikan oleh Dr. Windy Triana. Saya bacakan dulu short bio-nya. Dr. Windy Triana is a lecturer at the Faculty of Sharia and Law, the State Islamic University, Syarif Hidayatullah Jakarta, and a researcher at PPIM, UIN Syarif Hidayatullah Jakarta. Windy Triana obtained her PhD from Melbourne Law School, the University of Melbourne. For her PhD, she won the Australian Award Scholarship, followed by Australian Leadership Awards. Before that, she won numerous awards, including the MA degree scholarship from Ministry of Religious Affairs and collaboration with Canadian International Development Agency and an upgrading scholarship at Leiden University. Among her interests are Islamic law and society, Islamic law and gender, and education for Islamic legal professional. Okay, without further ado, I will give the opportunity to Dr. Windy to deliver her presentation.
Thank you, Bu Iim, and thank you, FISIP and Pak Halimun Hani for the opportunity. Can you hear my voice? Because I'm just wandering around to check my internet connection. Unfortunately, in the faculties, the internet connection is not really good, including my cell phone has a bad internet connection here. Okay. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang. This is my presentation. It's on gender and reform of Islamic judges education in Indonesia. My presentation is actually based on my research, my PhD research on reforming the education for Islamic judges in Indonesia, and also extracted from my following research on
Windy, sepertinya suaranya freeze ya? Atau mungkin videonya boleh dimatikan dulu?
Matikan ya?
Iya, suaranya.
Oke, sudah terdengar?
Ya, silakan.
Oke, good. It's important to mention that my research is, the data in my research is from 2017 and backwards. So there might be some of them this is the background. First, Indonesian Islamic courts mostly deal with family cases involving women, as Rachel mentioned about the divorce and inheritance, so on. And then gender-related cases in family law handled by the religious courts, such as divorce right, forced divorce, child maintenance, and so on. And the importance of Islamic legal, the importance of gender in legal education is because lack of gender issues in legal education has contributed to gender discrimination in legal practice. This is proven by several studies as follows. And actually, in Indonesia, it has been development in the response of judiciary to the to gender issues. For example, in 2015, the Supreme Court issued a decree, and this has been changed to in 2016, which is the establishment of the Working Group for Women and Children. And this working group then resulted a Supreme Court Regulation number 3 on the guidelines of adjudicating cases for women before the law. I'm showing you a picture of, this is a new picture in 2022 on Dialog Yudisial Mahkamah Agung RI. This picture becomes important because in this event, the Supreme Court still talk about how to deal with post-divorce right for women. This means that they still face challenges and it still become a significant issue faced by the Islamic judiciary. And in the context of Indonesia, judicial education for judges consists of two: legal education at Islamic universities and judicial education at CGT or Balitbang Diklat Kumdil. As for legal education, it actually only after the period of Suharto in the New Order era that Islamic judges should be graduated from Islamic universities or non-Islamic universities, but should master Islamic law. So that's the regulation produced by Suharto. The context, the nature of Islamic judges, actually, at the beginning they are called Qadi, and they came from ulama and graduated from madrasah and had a monopoly on Islamic knowledge and authority in interpreting the sacred sword of Islamic law. So people relied on their expertise in Islamic law. But in the modern era, there has been changes, transformation in the nature of Islamic judges. The first, that they are now no longer required to master religious knowledge and to produce legal decision out of their creative interpretation.
Windy?
Ya, hilang lagi?
Silakan lanjut.
Oke, hilang lagi ya? Enggak.
Lihat tadi, silakan lanjut aja. Ya.
Okay. So, and they have to be university graduate and educated and appointed by the state. So this means that the state has full power over the judiciary, over the Islamic judges. And this is different from the past nature of Islamic judges. What I want
Windy, putus lagi. Halo Windy? Masih di mute?
Halo, suaranya sudah kedengeran?
Ya, sekarang. Silakan lanjut.
Oke. Saya di luar. Sorry, di fakultas ini agak challenging internetnya sekarang. Oke. So, this is the picture of Islamic legal education and how gender integrated into the curriculum. This is from 2017 curriculum. You can see that these are the courses where gender issues included, from the inheritance, marriage, and then comparative Islamic legal thoughts on marriage, and then religious affairs office, child protection law, and family mediation. Unfortunately, we have only one course where gender is explicitly become the course, which is family law and gender. This is before it was elective course. So meaning that the student can choose whether they take it or not. But currently they change it into compulsory course with 2 credits. However, there's still a lecturer on family law and gender. They said it's uneasy to impose the idea of gender equity to students because they have limited credits. 2 credits is not sufficient. And also, some of them are lack of updated discussion on gender issues. This means that not all lecturers in those courses have gender perspective when teaching inheritance, when teaching marriage, and so on. So I would say that the integration of gender issues
Ya, Windy. Windy masih di mute dan tadi terputus, Windy.
masih putus nggak?
Sekarang udah, silakan.
Masih putus.
Iya, lanjut aja deh.
Halo?
Ya, silakan Windy.
Halo. Oke.
Suaranya belum hilang lagi, Windy. Halo, Windy. Sepertinya Windy-nya internetnya bermasalah. Mungkin kita tunggu beberapa menit ya. Windy, apakah sudah bergabung?
Saya sudah hadir
iya.
lagi. So
Silakan,
sorry. Iya, internet di fakultas agak sebentar. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Belum.
Belum.
Oh ya, sekarang.
Okay, these are types of education offered by the Center for Judicial Training or CJT. We say in bahasa Indonesia kinds of education for judges. The first is the initial judicial training or the pre-appointment training. And the second one is in-service training. They have continuing education, certification training, and technical training. Unfortunately, sorry, I think. And the initial judicial training is for judges before their appointment. So before they're appointed as a full judges, they have to undergo initial judicial training. If you see, this is the curriculum of the initial judicial training one.
Ini bisa di full screen supaya lebih jelas.
Oke. Iya, sudah terlihat full screen-nya?
Ya. Hilang.
Okay. These are the courses in the initial judicial with Livingstone Armitage's categorization of judicial education. As you can see, there is no courses on women or gender issue or even social justice or anything related to social or social issues. And this is my conclusion to that reading, that in the early phase of judicial reform, sorry.
Ya, Windy, suaranya hilang.
Oke, sorry, ada banyak peserta di sini. Oke, in the early phase of judicial reform, that the judiciary still focus on better court administration. As a consequence, that all courses in the curriculum are seen as primary knowledge and skill to be mastered by the judges to be. This means is treated as a secondary competence. And in the continuing judicial education, they have what we call as pendidikan berkelanjutan for the judges. This is the curriculum in 2014. I divided the curriculum with the Livingstone Armitage's categorization of judicial education, and still social course on social context, course on gender, still missing from the curriculum. Until 2016, the continuing judicial education curriculum was slightly changed, but not in the content of the curriculum. Still, the social context, including gender, missing from the curriculum. So where are the gender issues in the curriculum of the judicial training? They have it in the in-service training called technical training. They have technical trainings program. This was arranged once a year, and however, they are mostly conducted with the collaboration with NGOs and other international organizations, like for example, UN Women in 2015, IPJ from Australia, Sustain from Netherlands, and they involve various Indonesian NGOs such as Komnas Perempuan, Fahmina, LBH Apik, and so on. What I can see is that the training on gender for the judges are still mostly conducted very sporadically. So it's unsystematic and quite ad hoc. So because they depend almost entirely on the support and encouragement from external institutions and donors. Capacity of Indonesian Islamic judiciary to address issues on gender inequality involving women also limited. Okay, I would like to go back to this regulation. You can see that I have this Supreme Court regulation number 3 of 2017 on guidelines for adjudicating cases of women before the law. This regulation is in collaboration between the Supreme Court with AIPJ and MAPI FHUI. This means that the Supreme Court themselves could not produce such guidelines without the help from the academics, from the NGOs, and from those who are critical about women issues. I heard that Pak Alimun Hanif earlier mentioned about the role of women NGOs. Yes, it is important. They are important. Women NGOs are very important in changing policies, in changing regulation, especially those related to women. You can see that I highlight the year 2015. This is where the CGT to uh, start to put gender and access to justice into the courts. So it means that they need someone. The judiciary, the Indonesian judiciary needs other institutions, needs academics to recognize that there is gender, that there are problems in the system and there are problems in regulation regarding women access to justice. Like, for example, in the issue of post-divorce rights, Rachel mentioned about it, and Ibu Rika mentioned about the post-divorce right. This is still this is still an issue. So not many judges brave enough to decide women getting post-divorce right if the cerai is cerai gugat. So this is the case with the in many religious. Fahmina has its figure, and they offer the notion of mutuality, kesalingan, mubadalah, and this is an important notion to be introduced to the judges. Without them, judges will have no time to do what academics do. So continuing judicial education is such important in this case. So this is my conclusion. So it is undeniable that wider judicial reform that began after the fall of Suharto have brought significant changes to the judicial education system for the religious court. Improvements indeed have been made because in previous time they have unsystematic, very systematic education system. However, the focus of judicial education is still on court procedure and administration, as I showed you before. Other crucial areas such as social awareness, particularly regarding gender, have long been largely ignored. That's the end of my presentation. So I'm so sorry for the internet connection. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Terima kasih banyak Windy yang sudah memaparkan hasil risetnya terkait bagaimana transformasi sistem pendidikan bagi hakim ya, yang kalau sebelum masa Soeharto masih tidak terstruktur, tapi di masa sekarang sebenarnya sudah lebih struktur. Cuma tadi kritiknya Windy, walaupun sudah lebih terstruktur, masih sangat fokus pendidikan hakim itu pada aspek prosedural dan administratif pengadilan gitu ya. Aspek-aspek sosial terutama gender yang tadi di-highlight Windy ternyata masih quote in quote sedikit diabaikan gitu ya, kalau di-review dari tadi misalnya dalam konteks perguruan tinggi Islam yang memang punya apa ya, spesialisasi untuk mencetak para hakim, ternyata kurikulum yang spesifik ada gendernya itu cuma satu ya tadi yang di-highlight Windy gitu ya, tapi itu tahun sebelumnya. Mudah-mudahan sih sekarang sudah lebih banyak mungkin di fakultas syariah yang ada di Indonesia yang memang concern nanti pada pencetakan para hakim gitu ya. Kurikulum berbasis gender ini mungkin perlu ditingkatkan gitu ya. Tadi juga Windy meng-highlight bahwa meskipun ada ya training terkait gender itu masih sangat sporadis dan masih sangat bergantung pada support dari donor dan NGO gitu ya. Jadi kalau inisiatif yang dari pengadilan sendiri itu masih sangat sedikit, bahkan tadi Supreme Court juga sangat tergantung pada tadi external institution gitu ya. Mungkin itu kurang lebih ya tantangan mungkin ya ke depannya bagaimana meningkatkan kualitas dari pendidikan hakim supaya lebih sensitif pada isu-isu sosial, mungkin tidak hanya isu gender, tapi salah satunya karena kita lagi mendiskusikan gender, maka isu gender penting untuk lebih di highlight gitu ya dalam kurikulum dan training-training para hakim, sehingga hakim ini punya perspektif gender yang lebih baik lagi gitu demi tadi mencapai akses equality akses to justice gitu for everyone, sebenarnya untuk semua orang, termasuk di dalamnya adalah perempuan gitu. Mungkin itu kurang lebih ringkasannya dari yang disampaikan Windy. Kita langsung masuk ke sesi diskusi. Mungkin kita buka beberapa termin. Saya buka termin pertama dulu, mungkin dengan 4 pertanyaan. Sebenarnya tadi saya sudah share di chat, tapi sepertinya mungkin mau langsung bertanya. Jadi silahkan yang mau bertanya langsung bisa raise hand. Ini saya sudah dapat satu ya, Aulian Anastasia. Yang kedua ada Labib. Yang ketiga ada Maula. Yang keempat ada Bu Zuriatin Toibah. Ya, untuk sesi pertama silahkan dimulai dari Aulia dulu. Silahkan dinyalakan mikrofonnya. Ya. Aulia, suaranya belum terdengar. Halo, Aulia?
Unmute.
Masih mute. Oke, yang lain dulu. Silakan Labib.
Oke, terima kasih Bu atas kesempatannya. Apakah suara saya terdengar, Bu?
Ya.
Oke, saya ingin bertanya Bu, dengan contoh kasus yang saya mau ambil itu adalah masyarakat pedesaan ya. Sebagaimana kita ketahui ya bahwa pada masyarakat desa itu penerapan mengenai tradisi itu dapat dikatakan lebih kuat gitu berlakunya dibandingkan masyarakat kota. Entah itu tradisi dari keagamaan, kebudayaan atau lain-lainnya. Nah, bagaimanakah cara perempuan yang ada di desa itu untuk bisa mendapatkan akses untuk berkarya dan berkontribusi dalam menghadapi hambatan situasi yang demikian tersebut, Bu, baik dari tradisi agama ataupun kebudayaan dan lain-lainnya.
Pertanyaannya ditujukan ke siapa ya? Terkait yang mana nih, pembicara yang mana?
Ke Miss Rachel.
Oh, Rachel. Jadi dalam kaitannya dengan divorce gitu, apakah ada perbedaan antara perempuan yang di pedesaan dan perkotaan gitu ya?
Ya.
Dalam
gitu,
akses
dalam menghadapi tradisi demikian, Bu.
Oke.
Terima kasih, Bu.
Ya, terima kasih Labib. Silakan Maula.
Baik, maaf Bu, apa suara saya terdengar?
Ya.
Mohon maaf Bu, saya off cam karena jaringan bisa kepental kalau on cam.
Ya, silakan.
Oke, baik, terima kasih atas kesempatannya untuk Ibu Im sebagai moderator dan dosen. Selamat pagi menjelang siang kepada dosen-dosen semua dan teman-teman semua, terutama pembicara yaitu Prof. Rachel dan Bu Rika dan Ibu Windy. Di sini saya izin bertanya, saya lebih kepada materi Prof. Rachel dan Bu Rika yang mengenai tentang semakin tingginya tingkat perceraian dan kekerasan setiap tahunnya itu kan semakin tinggi nih di Indonesia gitu kan. Apalagi sekarang itu perempuan itu udah banyak nih yang tadi yang Ibu Im highlight itu tentang power yang dari knowledge itu loh, dari ilmu pengetahuan itu semakin banyak perempuan dengan yang pendidikan yang tinggi, semakin besar juga kekuatan perempuan untuk bebas dari kehidupan pernikahan yang tidak bahagia. Makanya sekarang itu kan banyak perceraian yang tadi yang digambarkan bahwa banyak perceraian yang didukung dari ketidakbahagiaan dalam rumah tangga itu sendiri. Nah, jadi apakah menurut apakah ada peluang atau kemungkinan bahwa semakin tahun ke depan itu tingkat perceraian di Indonesia dan kasus tingkat perceraian di Indonesia itu semakin meningkat dan kasus pernikahan itu semakin menurun. Apalagi kan sekarang tuh banyak perempuan yang tren dari perempuan itu ingin bercita-cita sebagai alpha woman yang pengen hidupnya mandiri tanpa ada ikatan yang berbelit-belit gitu, sehingga ketidaksetaraan gender itu bisa hilang gitu loh dengan ada kesetaraan gender sebagai alpha woman itu sendiri. Seperti itu sih, Bu.
Oke. Jadi
Terima kasih.
Maula menanyakan prediksi ke depan gitu ya dengan peningkatan tingkat pendidikan perempuan, apakah dalam konteks Indonesia tren perceraian itu akan terus meningkat dan pernikahan menurun seperti yang terjadi di negara-negara maju gitu ya ke depannya ya, prediksi dari Rachel dan Bu Rika seperti apa. Oke, selanjutnya Bu Zuriatin Thayyibah.
Well, thank you very much, Bu Iim. My voice is good enough?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you the very interesting presentation from Rachel, from Urika, and from Windy. From Rachel, I think from your presentation about the high rate of divorce in Indonesia, I think can we make it as an indicator that social change occur in Indonesia? I mean, you know, from the regulation and the rule, we know that patriarchal culture is still very strong, yeah. But women still can take the benefit. I mean, they can use this rule and regulation to seek justice, and then they also can struggle their rights. But the regulation is still, you know, very conventional and still use the old paradigm in Islam. But as women now are more independent, measure from their education and also their income and others, then they can still have the bargaining position to stop, to withdraw from their bad marriage or from their unhappy marriage. I also want to know about the situation of husband. It seems to me that the intention to change is only from women. Russell, do you also interview husband? Because it seems to me that they reluctant. They still have very conventional and patriarchal behavior, and they do you think that they also have the intention to change, like to accommodate the right of women, and then we can make, because if we want, if the change is really the real change, I mean, we can expect that Indonesia is getting better. Then we must have the balance between men and women attitudes. So my question is, to what extent men also have the good intention for this. And for Ibu Rika, that women brave enough to seek the justice by choosing for divorce, but they don't really brave enough to imprison their husband because of domestic violence. They usually, more relax, lebih tidak maulah sampai memenjarakan suaminya gitu kan. But even they still not free from domestic violence when they choose to divorce, as you mentioned, Burika. And then, yeah, it's the current issue. I think you know, Rizky Bilar and Lestri, for example, ya, she already dia sudah mengadukan ya ke pengadilan, but finally she withdraw, she stop to continue the case. But you know, the fact that my husband with the laki-laki suami yang biasa melakukan domestic violence gitu kan, they are very dangerous, I think, and even the wife already divorced from him. Probably he will make another domestic violence from another wife. We know usually men are really easy to get married again when they divorce. Do you think that we need, you know, a kind of intervention from other individual or probably institution, for to deal with this case? I mean, if women as a wife cannot, they do not brave enough to continue the case of domestic violence for seeking justice, but the fact that they already, but the fact that husband conducted domestic violence are very dangerous. So I think we need to pay attention about this case of domestic violence. Jadi menurut saya harus ada ya, maksudnya individu, institusi atau mereka yang memiliki concern ya dalam masalah-masalah domestic violence, sehingga kemudian orang tidak, keadilan tidak hanya didasarkan pada itu kemauan istri ya yang atau victim ya, korban dari domestic violence gitu kan. Akhirnya kita cuma ya akan muter-muter di sini gitu kan. Kalau suami istrinya udah ridho ya sudah, mau gimana lagi gitu kan. Jadi sejauh mana sistem hukum kita kemudian mensupport ya proses bagaimana domestic violence itu bisa berkurang ya ke depan. Terus Mbak Windy ya, I think, you know, the law faculty is very conventional. Sorry to say. I mean, but we really need the law faculty to make a change. I mean, because we can change by law, we cannot. Kita tidak bisa berubah dengan dengan berdasarkan keinginan kita. Kalau tidak ada hukumnya, secara hukum tidak legal, ya berarti ya akan perubahan-perubahan ke depan yang lebih baik, saya kira tidak bisa dilakukan. Nah, saya kira memang PR-nya banyak ya, kurikulum bagaimana membuat hakim ya, hakim. Dan saya kira Bu In juga punya ya, kemarin penelitian tentang hakim perempuan ya. Sejauh mana ya, maksud saya ada nggak Bu Windy juga membuat ini ada nggak misalnya penilaian gitu ya terhadap bahwa sebelum mereka menjadi hakim itu sejauh mana perspektif ya kesadaran gender para calon hakim ini. Saya kira begitu Bu Im, thank you very much. Bu Im masih mood.
Oke, tadi Bu Iba menanyakan ke Rachel terkait bagaimana perspektif laki-laki ya dalam hal ini suami gitu. Mungkin Rachel nanti bisa mengeksplor from your interview on husbands, perspektif mereka tentang kondisi dan perubahan terkait gender. Kalau yang Bu Rika saya kayaknya komentar ya, saya nggak menangkap pertanyaannya. Terus Yang Windy, terus apakah ada penilaian perspektif gender di kalangan calon hakim itu seperti apa sebelum mereka menjadi hakim gitu? Penilaian terkait itu ya.
Yang Bu Rika itu lebih bagaimana bahwa secara hukum biar kasus penanganan kekerasan seksual itu tidak diserahkan kepada perempuan saja sebagai korban gitu. Kalau misalnya dia sudah merasa bahwa kasus tidak diteruskan, kan kemudian tidak diteruskan. Seharusnya kan kalau kita mau melakukan sesuatu yang lebih substansial gitu, kalau udah terlanjur masuk kasusnya ya dilanjutkan walaupun perempuannya sudah menganggap itu tidak ada gitu. Secara hukum seperti apa gitu maksudnya ini?
Jadi apakah mungkin memungkinkan gitu ya kasusnya tetap ditindaklanjuti? Bu Rika kan tadi Bu Rika banyak menjelaskan alasan challenge-nya terkait domestic violence itu pencabutan laporan gitu ya. Nah, apakah mungkin ada mekanisme atau institutional mekanisme gitu ya yang bisa tetap melanjutkan kasus kekerasan perempuan meski yang bersangkutan itu sudah mencabut atau mungkin laporannya mungkin gitu ya Bu Iba? Oke. Terus satu lagi, Aulia silakan, ditujukan ke siapa? Pertanyaannya mungkin bisa singkat ya.
Oke. Aku ingin bertanya 2 pertanyaan, satu kepada Miss Rahel dan kedua untuk spesifik untuk Bu Rika. Pertanyaan untuk Miss Rahel, saya akan bertanya tentang efek dari divorce kepada anak. Sebenarnya keputusan orang tua untuk divorce itu dan menjadi single parent itu untuk menyelamatkan diri sendiri atau menyelamatkan diri dan anak, dan apakah perceraian memberikan efek yang buruk gitu terhadap mental anak jika para pelaku yang menginginkan menjadi single parent itu sudah memiliki anak. Karena beberapa kasus yang terjadi di sekitar saya, mereka atau sang anak itu jadi harus lebih dewasa gitu sejak umur yang sangat muda, sehingga ketika bertambahnya umur dan menjadi dewasa ataupun menjadi orang tua, mereka mengalami kelelahan mental dan pikiran serta mengalami kekosongan diri, yang dimana 3 hal ini nih berpengaruh gitu terhadap aktivitas sosialnya, baik dalam lingkungan diri sendiri, lingkungan pertemanan, kekeluargaan, pendidikan, dan lain sebagainya. Seperti itu untuk Miss Rahel. Yang kedua, spesifik untuk Bu Rika. Sebenarnya apa sih yang menyebabkan para aparat itu melempar-lemparkan kasus kekerasan pada perempuan dan lebih cepat menangani serta menyelidiki kasus secara hukum mengenai pemeran perempuan di dalam video porno di sosial media? Dan dari beberapa kasus kekerasan, baik yang dialami laki-laki maupun perempuan, harus melalui jalur viral dulu gitu di sosial media, baru ditindak secara serius. Tapi nggak sedikit dari kasus yang ada penanganannya itu malah disuruh berdamai secara kekeluargaan. Bahkan padahal orang yang kena kekerasan itu datang ke aparat untuk meminta bantuan secara hukum gitu, bukan secara kekeluargaan. Seperti contohnya pada bulan September tahun 2021 kemarin, viral di sosial media tentang cerita pelecehan seksual yang dialami salah satu pegawai laki-laki di KPI Pusat yang sudah terjadi selama 3 tahun. Kenapa cerita ini diviralkan? Karena sebenarnya korban sudah mengalami kekerasan dari tahun 2012 sampai 2015. Ketika baru pertama kali mengalami kejadian, korban sudah melakukan pelaporan gitu ke Komnas HAM, tapi kemudian setiap melapor, Komnas HAM itu malah melemparkan kasusnya kepada Polsek Gambir. Terus Polsek Gambir menyuruh korban untuk balik kanan dan diselesaikan secara internal antara korban dan 8 orang pelaku, sehingga belum ada penyelesaian terhadap kasus ini. Lalu habis itu karena udah mandek nih dari 2012 sampai 2015 gak ada penanganan dari pihak aparat, akhirnya korban memilih cara untuk memviralkan kasus tersebut, tapi malah menjadi bumerang gitu, karena yang diputuskan oleh petinggi KPI sendiri malah menonaktifkan korban dan memberikan surat penertiban terhadap terhadap korban, karena korban absen sehari setelah mendapatkan status dinonaktifkan kepegawaiannya. Seperti itu. Apakah sudah cukup nangkep gitu pertanyaannya? Terima kasih.
Ya, terima kasih. Mungkin saya sedikit mereframe ya pertanyaannya Aulia ya. Aulia has question to Rachel. She asked you about how is the effect of divorce on children. Do you think from your research and based on the interview you had, maybe you could find any evidence that women decided to divorce is because they want to, to save herself, or it's also considerations of their children, because we cannot neglect the fact that if the parent divorce, there will always be a impact to the children. Terus yang tadi ke Ibu Rika tadi mungkin sudah ditangkap ya Bu, terkait kenapa sih kalau kasus kekerasan itu selalu dilempar-lempar, tidak cepat ditangani, tapi kalau pornografi aja cepat, dan apalagi kalau pornografi biasanya jadi yang tersangka dan ininya yang di-highlight tuh lagi-lagi adalah perempuan gitu ya. Terus bagaimana juga dengan tadi yang kasus kekerasan terhadap laki-laki. Mungkin itu ya dulu Bu. Mungkin kesempatan pertama mungkin dari ke Rachel, lalu diurutkan saja ke Bu Rika dan Windy, silahkan. Ya.
Okay. Ya, saya bisa mulai. Okay, mungkin mungkin saya akan lupa, tapi just don't be afraid to remind me if I forget anyone's questions. There were so many. Okay, mengenai isu masyarakat desa, ya betul, itu situasi untuk masyarakat desa biasanya nilai-nilai agama sangat kuat, dan biasanya tingkat pendidikan untuk perempuan biasanya lebih rendah. Juga biasanya perempuan di desa mungkin kurang akses untuk child care, atau biasanya mungkin mereka kerja di sektor tidak resmi, di informal sector. Jadi ya situasi mereka bisa sedikit berbeda kadang-kadang. What I saw from my research is that women in more rural areas, sometimes they get a divorce in an informal way. This is the old style, where you talk to your ulama and they decide whether to grant you a divorce. So you don't go through the court. So technically this is not legal in Indonesia, but it's still common. It's not as common as it used to be. But I still found some women who were divorced this way. Sometimes it is actually faster and easier, because their lama is like their tetangga. So, they see this as simple. But the problem is that it doesn't always ensure that they get their rights under the law. Especially custody of children. And so actually there's been some previous research on this issue. Some of you might be aware of Bu Yuis Nurlailawati has done a lot of research on this issue, and she found that part of the reason more women it looks like there is a rise in divorce cases, but what this reflects is that more women are aware that they can get their rights through going to court. And so I think, women are becoming increasingly aware, and they're motivated to go to the court, especially for the custody issue. And that seemed, for the women I talked to, that was the number one concern for them, was custody. So I think in rural areas, this is still lagging behind a little bit. And I think that reflects women's lack of education. Their lack of job opportunities often means that their social network is very small, so they may not be aware that they could get their rights by going to court rather than just by talking to their ulama. Should I go on to the other question?
I think you could go on to all your questions and then we move on to other speakers.
Okay, juga ada pertanyaan mengenai divorce sebagai indikator perubahan sosial. And the narratives of husbands. So I agree. I think that divorce is definitely an indicator of social change, because it reflects, especially if women are the ones seeking divorce, then it reflects the fact that they are looking to exit marriages that are problems for them, and also that they have enough financial independence to be able to consider leaving a marriage. So it's very much an indicator of social change for that reason. Yes, husbands tended to express more conventional views of marriage. And in fact, many of them, when I talked to them about why they divorced, there weren't, in fact, most of the husbands I talked to, it wasn't a case of charai talak, it was a case of charai gugat, because more women are the ones who are suing for divorce. The husbands tended to complain that women, their wives were not paying enough attention to them, that their wives were prioritizing their careers, or were like prioritizing their social lives. And I think this reflects, the husbands having a more traditional view of marriage, where their wife is available to cook for them all the time, does all the child care, takes care of the house, and does everything for them. And so, yeah, I agree. I think there's a bit of an imbalance, right? Where women, I think, are expressing aspirations for a more mutual marriage where they are both contributing on a more equal basis. And a lot of men aren't necessarily on board with that view yet. So I think some are, but I think there's work to be done to convince men that this is actually, in the long run, would be a good thing for them too. There's so much research, at least coming out of the US and Europe, that, for example, in marriages where the husband does more childcare and more housework tend to be happier marriages. And in fact, are a reason that people stay together in marriages. So if we don't want people to get divorced, a more equal marriage actually tends to result in a more stable marriage. Dan dampak perceraian terhadap anak-anak. I think as Bu Iim suggested, we have to think about what are the effects of a troubled marriage on the children. And actually, I think, generally speaking, there's a lot of scholarship on this, and children witnessing a marriage where the parents are fighting a lot or where there's abuse happening, that this is actually much worse for them than being raised by a single parent, that seeing their parents fighting or seeing their mother being abused by their father, or sometimes being abused themselves by the father, because sometimes I talked to several women who said their husband abused them and he abused the children as well. So this is actually often a very negative situation for the children. It's also, I think it's important there's, I think, an increasing amount of research that shows that children look at their parents, right, for a model of what a marriage should be and what a relationship should be. And so it's really important for them to have a good model. If they don't see their parents in a happy marriage, then it's likely that down the road, they themselves might not have a good understanding of what a happy relationship is between two people. And so it becomes harder for them to achieve that in their own life. So I think, and a lot of women expressed this to me, actually, that they felt that they were getting divorced, certainly for their own happiness, but also for their children, so that their children wouldn't have to live with this unhappy model of marriage, right? And it's important, especially for children, to see their mother, if they're spending a lot of time with their mother, if she's an unhappy person, this doesn't make for a good family situation.
Oke, mungkin ada satu, Rachel. Your predictions on the future trends on divorce in Indonesia. Do you think Indonesia will experience the same trend as the Western society, where the women educations increase and then consequently the divorce rate increase and the marriage decline?
Well, I think it may start to plateau a little bit. I think right now Indonesia is in a situation maybe somewhat similar to what the US or Europe was in 30 or 40 years ago, where I think women started to become more educated and have more opportunities. And at the same time, the divorce laws were liberalized. And so it became easier to get a divorce, because previously in America, it had been very hard for women to get divorce. And so then there was a huge rise in the divorce rate because of that. I think we're seeing something a little bit similar now in Indonesia, where women have more work opportunities, have more education, and are not happy with the way marriage is constructed currently in Indonesia. But I think something that might change that dynamic is, right now there is still a lot of pressure for women to get married, and men too. And often I think this is partly what results in a lot of unhappy marriages, right? Because many people marry someone who's not the right person for them because of pressure from their families and their communities. And, perhaps in the US, what has happened is that as people have married later, the divorce rate actually has dropped a little bit. And the divorce rate in the US has decreased for people who are highly educated. So people who have a university education are much less likely to divorce. So I think actually, if the population continues to be more educated in Indonesia, and maybe people start waiting to marry until a little bit later when they're older and more mature, then I think we might actually see divorce level out a little bit. I don't think marriage will go away. I mean, I think, for people's religion, I think it's important to most people to marry in Indonesia. Even in the US, I think there's this stereotype that like marriage is gone. But actually, if you look at the statistics over the course of people's lives, about 90% of people in the US are married at some point in their lives. So actually, it's still like the vast majority of people will marry at some point, but it has become more optional in terms of the timing. And it's easier to exit the marriage if necessary. And so I think those kinds of changes, we'll see some of that here as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Rachel. Silakan Bu Rika untuk jawabannya dari pertanyaannya. Yang tadi terkait Bu Rika itu.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think a lot of questions for me, and the question is all very difficult to answer, but I will try to answer. Okay, the first one from Maula. Maula already, the question is already answered by Rachel. Maybe from
Aulia.
Aulia, okay. Yeah. Okay. Why the domestic violence? Yeah, domestic violence did not processed well by the police. Yeah. I think it's because violence against women's cases is not a sexy case. So for apparatus, the case compared to pornography cases is a bit different. In Indonesia, the pornography cases usually involve the high profile actors. Most of the cases, if we read the newspaper or in television, most of the pornographic cases involve the high profile artists, actors, and there's fulus behind. But for the domestic violence, it happens to all women, regardless of their social status, education, economic or financial. So even though the cases are in the same public domains, even though the domestic violence happens in a household, but it becomes public matters, not only a private matters anymore. And then Aulia asked about violence against men. In the case of KPI, in the case of employee in KPI. In my opinion, why the process is not very well, because gender bias still in the apparatus mind. Their perspective still gender bias because of some reasons. The first, patriarchal system. They look at the sex roles between men and women. Man is strong. Man is a strong person. Man is rational. And then the second one, less of cases against men. So the apparatus, lack of concern with these cases. And then what else? Okay, yes. At the moment, in 2000, in 2000, I forget. The main report in 2020. Is it right? There is no adequate legislation or regulation to violence or to sexual violence or to bullying. I hope the issue of the Undang-Undang Tindak Pidana Kekerasan Seksual, the issue of the Sexual Violence Act will give a hope to cope this violence. So there is no regulation about bullying. Yeah, the case of the employee in KPI, it's mostly is bullying, and we have no regulation on bullying. Yeah. We have, but it's very limited. It's very limited in penal code. But it doesn't mention deeply about bullying. And then the other factors is also the apparatus perspective and also the legislation, as I mentioned. Okay, and then for Ibu Suryatonto Yibah. Okay. Okay, why women doesn't want to imprison their husband who committed to domestic violence? Yeah, I think a lot of factors influence the women's decision to whether imprison or not their husband. The first, from financial factors. If the woman has her own income, I think she has she brave to imprison their husband, not imprison, maybe to report to police. But as what Bu Suryatonto Yibah mentioned about the case of Rizky Bilar, yeah, I think what the Leslie Bilar done, it has demonstrated her power. She used power to report her husband who committed domestic violence, but she still considered about her husband, about the father of her child. She doesn't want her husband or her father of the father of her child become narapidana. What is narapidana?
Criminal. Pakai bahasa Indonesia nggak?
Become a criminal. Yeah, become a criminal. Yeah, even though I'm sure that Leslie has a financial independence. Yeah, but social culture will be an obstacle for her decision making. Okay, and then what happens? What should we do? What Indonesian system? Okay, I think we have to. There are many reasons to improve our system, our legal system, to eliminate domestic violence. The first one, we have to empower women itself, not only women as the victim of domestic violence, but all women, and also men, female and male, must have to be empowered, have to be educated, must be educated, need to be educated about domestic violence, about gender equality, yeah. And then second one, to educate the apparatus. Even though the Domestic Violence Act issued in 2014, but the perspective of apparatus bias. Why? I think because the patriarchal system still strong in our community. And then, so the apparatus education is need to raise their concern about this case. And then the third one, to establish the facilitation. Domestic Violence Act already regulates. I think domestic violence is a progressive legislation. Yeah. But it's not enough only issued a legislation without improving the apparatus perspective and also the facilitation. Domestic Violence Acts have been regulates the facilitators such as shelter. Yeah. But not all Indonesian province has such a facilitation. So this is the to protect the women who come the victim of domestic violence. Yeah, this is the problem in Indonesia. And then, okay, to educate bride and groom before marriage. We have no marriage education for men and women who will marry. I think only special religion like a Catholic give such education, give such a marriage education. And then what else? I think so the effort to eliminate domestic violence needs to comprehensive action. As I mentioned, ecological approach, not only from the women itself, but also the family, also the community, also the apparatus, also the state. Indonesian government issued many regulations, already issued many regulations. But it must be supported by community and also the apparatus. Okay, because if I think Prof. Rachel recognized the theory of Friedman. From Friedman, the legal system consists of three elements: the substantive, and then correct me if I mistaken. Substantive, the legislation, and then the apparatus, and then the legal culture. Legal culture is from the community. So three elements must be work together. If it doesn't work together, so domestic violence and other violence still occur in our community. Okay, and then what else? What else, Mbak Iim?
Sepertinya sudah semua, Ibu, udah dijawab semua.
Oke.
Sekarang tinggal Windy. Windy, pertanyaannya Bu Zuriatun Thoibah, apakah ada penilaian untuk calon hakim terkait gender sensitivity mereka, misalnya kalau level sensitivity-nya segini, apakah mereka diterima jadi calon hakim atau bagaimana? Ada mekanisme seperti itu nggak dalam konteks?
Okay, of course not. Of course not. Tapi before answering the question, we are in some extent indeed very conservative, very traditional, and it is true for many law schools. Tidak hanya Fakultas Syariah dan Hukum, tapi juga law school secara umum, bahwa kita cenderung konservatif dan tradisional in some extent. However, ada perubahan regulasi, the changes in regulation, and then it needs awareness, and the awareness begins from the law school, from legal academia, like us. I remember that Pak Arskal Salim and Bu Isnur Lelawati, they conducted a research on the judicial training for judges in Aceh. They found that it wasn't easy to instill the idea of gender equity to their mind, as they are old generation. So sepanjang there will be changes in generation, like the younger generation would be probably, and we hope, have more gender awareness compared to the old generation. Like our new research, my research with Bu Iim on female, on gender and judging, we found that the younger judges have stronger awareness towards gender equity. Yeah, that's what we found. That so it's true that we are conservative, but we have things to do. We have things significantly can change the paradigm of gender equity in the judiciary. Like I said, that the nature of Islamic judges, they came from ulama, they came from Islamic scholars. Even before Suharto, they hadn't experienced any university education, but then after the reform, they started to experience the university education, the modern education, and this changed many aspects of Islamic judiciary. Yep, that's my answer. Thank you, Taim.
Yep, thank you, Wendy. I think we still have a time. I think we might invite other participants for the second discussion session. And we already have one question from Ibu Ella Prihatini. Do you want to ask directly, or I will read your question in the chat? Sepertinya tidak di tempat. Atau mungkin sambil menunggu, is there any other questions from other audience? You could raise your hand. Bisa di raise hand-nya biar kelihatan kalau ada yang mau bertanya lagi. Silakan. Ya, Bu Rika.
May I add some answer for Ibu Suryatonto Yiba?
Oh ya, silakan Bu.
Yeah, Ms. Suryatonto Yiba asked, so what can make husband or men change their attitude to be more aware about justice for women? Yeah, I think from the first, I think is from family, how to educate their child to be equal between men, between boy and girl. Yeah, and then, yeah, I think education is more important to give the basic knowledge and basic behavior, and then this education must be done not only in the private level but also in public level. I think it's the main reason to change the attitude between men and women, and how to change male perspective toward women, toward female. Thank you.
Yap, terima kasih Bu Rika. Ini sudah ada 3 penanya ya. Ada Irenka, Muhammad Naufal, sama Hasina. Mungkin kita mulai dari Irenka dulu, sambil mungkin menunggu yang Bu Ella ini. Silakan Irenka.
Ya, baik. Terima kasih Bu. Izin bertanya kepada Ibu Rika. Tadi Ibu Rika sempat meng-highlight bahwa perceraian itu jadi salah satu strategi untuk mengakhiri domestic violence ya. Namun pada beberapa kasus saya menemukan bahwa perempuan itu sulit untuk menceraikan suaminya. Salah satunya itu karena stigmatisasi janda. Dan juga saya melihat bahwa domestic violence ini kasusnya cukup kompleks dan menjadi banyak pertimbangan istri untuk menceraikan suaminya. Nah, bagaimana kita sebagai masyarakat dapat men-encourage perempuan untuk menceraikan suaminya ketika terjadi kekerasan domestik? Terima kasih.
Oke, terima kasih Irenka. Silakan Naufal.
Ya, baik. Terima kasih Bu Iim atas kesempatannya. Saya izin bertanya, mungkin pertanyaan saya sederhana saja, tapi mungkin bisa dijawab oleh ketiga pemateri. Pertanyaan saya mengenai, ini kan masing-masing dari penelitian dari ibu-ibu pemateri sekalian mengenai isu yang sensitif gitu ya bagi perempuan ini, domestic violence gitu. Dan juga mungkin ketika perempuan itu mengalami kekerasan dari suaminya, mungkin mereka akan lebih memilih untuk diam atau menutup diri. Kira-kira ada kesulitan tersendiri nggak sih dalam meneliti atau mencari tahu data dari wanita atau yang mengalami kekerasan ini? Dan terakhir, apakah ada saran gitu bagi kami sebagai peneliti muda dalam meneliti hal-hal yang sensitif seperti ini, namun menarik untuk digali seperti itu? Terima kasih. Gitu aja pertanyaannya, Bu.
Oke, itu dari Naufal. Langsung dari Hasina.
Ya baik, sebelumnya terima kasih atas kesempatannya. Saya izin bertanya mengenai perceraian dari kasusnya KDRT dan kaitannya itu dengan victim, si korban. Kan perceraian itu kan tadi sempat dijelasin ya, kalau nggak jadi jaminan juga nih, kalau si victim itu bakalan lepas atau bebas dari serangan kekerasan, terutama bahkan dari mantan pasangannya itu atau suaminya itu, mantan suaminya. Nah, jadi itu sebenarnya perceraian itu merupakan solusi untuk melepaskan diri dari kehidupan pernikahan yang mengalami KDRT atau malah jadi bumerang sih bagi si victim yang nerima domestic violence ini. Nah, terus habis itu kan juga banyak ya kasus yang orang nih ngalamin KDRT itu tapi malah masih bertahan sama status pernikahannya, karena kan kalau di Indonesia juga ada anggapan ya kalau misalkan bercerai itu juga mengartikan bahwa dia itu bakal nyebar aib keluarga. Nah, sebenarnya tuh mitra seperti apa sih yang dibutuhkan gitu loh, yang sifatnya itu suportif dan juga useful terhadap kasus KDRT ini, dan yang bisa ngeprotek si victim dari kasus KDRT ini, gitu sih kurang lebihnya. Terima kasih.
Oke, satu lagi dari Mbak Ella, ini saya bacakan saja ya, sepertinya yang bersangkutan belum ada. Domestic violence is not unique to certain socioeconomic status, let alone the dichotomy developed and developing countries. Thus, it is critical to learn different strategies applied in other places on how to minimize the damage from domestic violence toward primary welfare. The law surely, ini nggak pertanyaan ya, komentar ya? Oh, ada pertanyaannya. The law surely need to provide a better approach in tackling the domestic violence. The judges need to apply the law and prioritizing the victims, and the domestic violence should not be seen and perceived as a stigma or a failure. Oh, it's only a comment. Sorry, it's not a question. I didn't read it at first. So there are 3 questions. The first one from Irenka to Bu Rika. Perempuan sulit menceraikan suaminya karena stigma terkait janda. Bagaimana ini Bu terkait respon Ibu terkait isu ini? Terus yang kedua dari Naufal, for all the speaker, it's more on methodological aspects. Since your study are on sensitive issues, he asked, what is the challenge to deal with sensitive issue research? And how, what is the suggestions for young researcher to deal with this kind of research? Lalu dari Hasina tadi terkait victim ya, kalau memang misalnya tadi victimnya justru malah tetap bisa mengalami kekerasan, apakah sebenarnya itu intinya apakah divorce itu sebenarnya solusi atau justru bukan solusi gitu ya, dan bagaimana mencari mitra yang suportif yang tadi bisa melindungi korban dari kekerasan domestik ini supaya tidak terus-menerus mungkin dikejar oleh mantannya gitu ya, yang masih mungkin obsesif. Kurang lebih itu. Mungkin mau siapa dulu? Mau Rachel dulu? Mungkin aspek metodologi dulu ya, mungkin biar lebih ini. Rachel, kita putar nanti bagian lainnya ke pembicara yang lain. Silakan.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk a little. That's a great question about advice for research on sensitive topics. And actually, this has become an issue that I think a lot of researchers are interested in. I think people are starting to realize that sometimes the research process, if we're not careful, can actually do harm to people, even while we're trying to understand their experiences. One thing that a lot of students in the sociology department where I'm from at the University of Colorado have become interested in recently is called trauma-informed interviewing. I'll just put that in the chat. And if you Google it, a lot of resources come up for how to do that. There are different kinds of strategies, but I think it's definitely important for researchers to be aware of the impact of their questioning to people, and to try to come up with some strategies to mitigate that impact, to make sure that they're not causing more harm. So I think, there are some basic things that are helpful to keep in mind. One is establishing trust between the interviewer, the researcher, and the person who's interviewed, making sure that the environment of the interview feels like a safe place for them. And one way to do that is, of course, by making sure they understand that they have a choice to participate in this interview. They don't have to, or if you ask a question that makes them feel uncomfortable, that they don't have to answer it, right? It's up to them. So I think, usually what I do in the beginning of interviews, and I'm actually required to do this by the guidelines for qualitative research in the US, is to, at the beginning of the interview, I get their consent for the interview, and I make sure that they understand that they have a choice to participate. They can stop at any time, and that their data will be confidential. I won't be, using their name or, telling other people what they said in the interview. So I think this is really important to establish the interview as a safe environment for them. But of course, sometimes also you have to recognize sometimes people won't want to do the interview, right? Because they don't want to disclose those experiences to someone. And I think we have to also just be willing to accept that as researchers. Another strategy that I think is helpful is that if you know beforehand that the topic you're interviewing is something like abuse or difficult experiences, you could provide a list of resources that people could access, because often they actually don't know how to get help for the problems that they're facing. So, if you're interviewing people about domestic violence, you could provide a list of therapists or counselors in their area that they could talk to if they want to. You could provide a list of, if it's a health related issue, you could provide a list of doctors that they could access in their area. So that way, if they're talking about something and it's clear that they're really experiencing difficulty, you can help point them to these resources and help connect them. I think it's important to recognize that I'm a social scientist, right? So I'm not a counselor, I'm not a therapist, right? So I have to be aware of my limitations. I can't counsel people personally who've experienced abuse, but I can help them find where to get help. So I think that can be useful. And even one of my students right now, my doctoral student, is in Nepal right now. And she's interviewing women who are survivors of sexual abuse in the conflict in the Civil War that happened there. So women who have experienced some very, very difficult, traumatic things. So she actually, her strategy was to find a local therapist in the regions where she's doing interviews. And she's already talked to that therapist and let them know that she might be referring some women to them. And so she brings that therapist's information to each interview and gives that to women so that they could talk to this person. And she made an arrangement where she actually paid ahead of time, gave some money to that therapist so that these women could go there without having to pay themselves. So, you know, those are some of the kinds of strategies that I think young researchers could think about.
Ya, terima kasih Rachel. Mungkin ke Windy dulu yang cuma satu pertanyaan karena Bu Rika banyak ya.
Iya.
Mungkin silakan kalau
Oke.
Apa sarannya untuk peneliti muda ini?
Oke, suara saya terdengar.
Ya.
Oke, jadi sebetulnya challenge-nya jadi bukan hanya bagi yang meneliti victim, yang dalam hal ini perempuan, tapi juga ketika kita meneliti aparatusnya, kita meneliti legal professionals-nya. Ini saya punya, yang terakhir saya punya penelitian tentang kekerasan dalam rumah tangga dan hubungannya dengan mediasi, bagaimana memediasi kasus perceraian yang melibatkan kekerasan dalam rumah tangga. Itu juga tidak mudah ketika kita menginterview mediatornya, karena ini adalah sensitif isu, jadi ada kecenderungan mereka seolah-olah mereka khawatir bahwa mereka dianggap tidak pro terhadap victim gitu. Jadi kadang-kadang jawabannya kita melihatnya itu tidak ada bagian-bagian yang ditutupi atau ada bagian yang mereka sebetulnya ya ditutupi lah, karena gini, mediasi dalam kasus kekerasan perceraian yang melibatkan kasus kekerasan di beberapa negara itu sudah tidak boleh dilakukan. Tapi di Indonesia masih dilakukan dan ada di beberapa negara juga masih dilakukan gitu. Jadi seolah-olah mereka tidak mau menjadi pihak yang disalahkan, tapi juga mereka tidak mau dianggap sensitif. Jadi kita memang betul-betul harus berstrategi ketika menghadapi responden semacam ini. Jadi bukan hanya berstrategi ketika kita menghadapi victim, tapi juga kita perlu berstrategi ketika kita bertanya kepada profesional gitu. Jadi bagaimana kita bisa mengungkap, bisa menguak itu dengan pertanyaan-pertanyaan yang sebetulnya bisa lebih diterima, tidak membuat mereka menolak menjawab atau tidak menutupi apa yang sebetulnya terjadi, karena lagi-lagi ini isunya, ya betul, ini adalah isunya sensitif gitu. Itu sih dari saya.
Oke, terima kasih Windy. Selanjutnya silakan Bu Rika. Nih ada beberapa pertanyaan ya untuk Bu Rika. Silakan.
I will not comment upon the methodological, because it's already answered by Rachel and Windy.
Okay.
It's difficult questions. Okay, becoming gender. Okay, how to encourage women? I always encourage my students, especially women, especially the girls, students. You have to, or you must be, you must have independence, financial or independent financial income. If you have your own money, so it's easy for you to do something or to choose something. If a woman doesn't have income, So she will depend on her spouse or her husband. This is the key. I think this is the main key to encourage women. Yeah. And then Mbak Irenke said that domestic violence is very complex. Yes, it is very complex. Moreover, if the couple has children, it's more complex. If only husband and wife, maybe it's easy for the wife to escape from domestic violence by divorce or ask the husband to divorce. But if they have children and the woman doesn't have independent financial income, so it's difficult for her to escape or to leave her spouse. She will think about how my children can eat, how or who will pay the children education, and how I can live. That's the questions. It's difficult. But if the woman has her own income, she doesn't have any fears about financial. Maybe social culture, she will be a bit fear because community judgment about her status, like becoming gender. So it's just important to educate community to change their mind. Gender is not always bad. Maybe for the women victims, when she divorced or has been divorced by her husband, becoming gender is okay. But the community has the problem. The community look at the woman who become a widow. It's bad because it's community perspective. So we have to change this. Why widower doesn't have a bad perspective? I think it's because this society, this community has been dominated by a male perspective. Based on their domination, male can make can communicate about widower is better. Widower doesn't have problem with social or community issues. Yeah. So why the gender or widow is always bad? Because it's community perspective. So we have to change it. Sometimes for the woman, it doesn't matter. I become a widow, but the community sometimes is because they have own norms, they have own values to judge women who ask divorce or who divorced. Okay, and then is the divorce become a solution or maybe the next problem? I think I will ask you, do you want to live in a horrible situation in your household? I ask you, do you want to live in this bad situation? Do you want to see your child exposed to domestic violence? Do you want to live in this situation? I think nobody wants to live in such situation. So if you or if this woman this woman has income, so it's easy for her to live because there's no fears of lack financial, because she can manage her own life. She has many choices actually, which one she will choose. Every decision has its impact, has its consequences. So the most important thing is to encourage this woman. If you leave your husband, it doesn't mean that your life ends, that your life will finish. So this is the important things. So, and then how to choose the good supportive system. As I mentioned before, if the woman has power means knowledge. So she can choose it. She can approach it if she has knowledge. If she has knowledge, she can approach it. But if the community has knowledge as well, they can support this woman. Sometimes some women doesn't have knowledge about how to approach this institution or how to approach NGO. What should they do? They don't have any idea. So the way to encourage women, we have to encourage these women and also this community. Because if community doesn't have knowledge about Domestic Violence Act, about the NGO or something, they can do nothing. They can help this woman. So the most important things, so we have to educate our staff and also our community. I think this is the answer, because domestic violence is a complex issue. Not only for the problem is not only the woman as the victim of domestic violence, but also our community become the problem if we don't have any concern, if we don't have awareness for this issue. If we have knowledge for this issue, we can approach to the state or the government if what they do is not inconsistent with domestic violence or other act dealing in violence. I think that's my answer, Mbak Iin.
Ya.
Thank you.
Terima kasih Bu Rika. Jadi menguatkan powernya perempuan dan komunitas di sekitarnya penting ya Bu ya, itu ya intinya mungkin. Oke, mungkin kita masih 2 pertanyaan lagi, boleh? Silakan kalau ada sebelum kita tutup. 2 atau 3, boleh? Atau tidak ada? Tidak ada. Atau dari Bapak Ibu dosen mungkin yang selain mahasiswa yang juga ingin bertanya? Oke, sepertinya sudah tidak ada. Berarti kita bisa menyelesaikan seminar ini lebih cepat dari jadwal yang kita rencanakan 12.30. Ini 12 hampir 15 ya. Once again, thank you very much for all the speaker today. Terima kasih banyak Rachel, Rinaldo, Windy Triana, dan Ibu Rika Saraswati atas kesempatannya berbagi dengan kami dari pagi tadi sampai siang hari ini. Ada banyak hal yang kita dapatkan dari sesi diskusi kita pagi ini. Kita melihat ada banyak perubahan atau usaha mentransformasi kondisi keadilan gender di Indonesia, tapi bukan berarti itu sudah final gitu ya. Ternyata dalam prosesnya ini masih ongoing proses, ada banyak PR-PR yang tadi disinggung juga oleh para pembicara terkait bagaimana kemudian lebih menguatkan lagi gitu ya gender equality ini. Seperti misalnya dalam kasus pendidikan hakim tadi perlu peningkatan lagi gender awareness-nya di kalangan hakim gitu. Kalau di kepolisian juga terkait domestic violence juga perlu misalnya aparat, apakah saya juga nggak tahu apakah di kalangan polisi juga ada semacam education terkait gender sensitivity ya, tapi kalau hakim aja nggak ada, saya nggak yakin di kepolisian sudah ada gitu training khusus untuk kajian seperti itu. Lalu juga mengempower masyarakat secara umum, dan mungkin tadi kritiknya tidak hanya perempuan ketika bicara gender equality is not only women, but we should involving other element of the society, including men gitu ya. Jadi mungkin PR kedepannya bagaimana mengencourage laki-laki juga ikut terlibat dalam proses meningkatkan gender equality dan awareness di masyarakat. Karena kalau yang di empower hanya perempuan, laki-lakinya tidak, atau komponen masyarakat lainnya tidak, maka sulit yang tadi disebut equality bisa tercapai gitu ya. Jadi perlu peran dari banyak pihak untuk menjadikan kondisi Indonesia jauh lebih baik dalam kaitannya dengan kualitas gender condition in Indonesia. Itu mungkin kurang lebih penutup dari saya. Sekali lagi saya ucapkan terima kasih banyak for all the speakers and also for all audience, dan semua Bapak Ibu dosen, mahasiswa, dan semua audiens yang lainnya yang sudah berpartisipasi dalam acara seminar kali ini. Terima kasih banyak. Saya akhiri dengan membaca alhamdulillah. Thank you so much. Semoga kita bisa ketemu lagi di lain waktu dalam seminar yang selanjutnya.